I first noticed the train late one night when I was returning from a long shift at the station. The platform was quiet, nearly deserted, only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the city beyond the tracks. The train arrived on time, with the familiar roar of steel wheels against the rails, yet when the doors slid open, I noticed immediately that it was empty. Not a single passenger, not the usual commuters, not the late-night travelers, not even someone sitting alone with a newspaper. It was a silent, metallic shell moving through the night with no indication of life inside, and a shiver ran down my spine. At first, I thought it was an error, a rare miscommunication, a mistake in the scheduling. The train still bore the numbers and destination of the regular route, yet the emptiness was profound and disturbing. I glanced through the windows and saw only the rows of seats dimly lit by overhead lights reflecting off the glass. No movement, no shadow, no hint of human presence. I stepped closer to the edge of the platform and called out softly, but the sound was swallowed in the metallic hum of the carriages. It was as though the train existed independently of the station and the world around it, moving through a reality I could not fully perceive. I returned the next night, compelled by curiosity and a sense of unease that had not left me since the first encounter. The train arrived at exactly the same time with the same precision, silent and empty. I waited longer this time, stepping onto the platform as the doors opened and feeling the cold breath of air that escaped from the carriages. I walked inside hesitantly and felt the faint vibration of movement beneath my feet. The interior was spotless too, clean, almost unreal in its perfection, yet there was no sound, no hint of life. I tried to imagine passengers sitting quietly reading newspapers or sleeping against the windows, but every seat was vacant. The emptiness pressed against me like a living thing, and I felt a sudden nausea, a wave of vertigo, as if the train itself was aware of my intrusion. Over the following days, I began to notice patterns. The train always arrived at the same time late at night, and always without passengers. Occasionally, a maintenance worker or station employee would remark that they had seen nothing unusual and assumed I was joking or imagining it. Yet I was certain of what I had seen. I documented every arrival, noting the time, the condition of the platform, the lighting, the hum of the rails, and the position of the train. Something was deliberate about its movements. The consistency and the precision suggested intelligence, not randomness, and I began to feel as if I were being observed not by passengers but by the train itself. The emptiness of the train became increasingly unsettling. I tried to take a seat, imagining that sitting might reveal something about its purpose. Yet the moment I touched the fabric of a seat, the air seemed to thicken around me. I could hear my own heartbeat amplified in the metallic stillness. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and I felt a sudden pull in my stomach, as if the train had become a weightless vessel moving through a space outside normal physics. I could not see through the walls, only the empty windows and the faint reflection of myself alone in a corridor with no origin and no end. The sensation was disorienting and terrifying, and I realized that I was facing something beyond explanation. By the end of the first week, I became obsessed. I arrived early, stayed late, and observed the tracks for any sign of passengers or anomaly. Sometimes I would glimpse shadows in the corner of my eye that vanished when I looked directly. Sometimes I heard the faintest echo of voices or footsteps in rhythm with the motion of the train, yet no one appeared. The emptiness seemed purposeful, deliberate, and malevolent in a way I could not articulate. The platform felt like a threshold between normalcy and something vast and unknowable. I began to dread the arrival of the train, and yet I could not stop myself from watching, waiting, and documenting each occurrence as if some unseen force demanded it. One night, I stayed on board until the train began to move. The station lights receded and the city beyond became dark silhouettes. I expected tunnels or familiar stops, but the train seemed to extend into a void of black space with no geography or landmarks. The hum of the rails became a low vibration in my chest, and a faint whisper of air carried a smell I could not place, metallic and cold yet organic. I turned to the end of the carriage, and for a moment thought I saw a figure, a shadow of a person standing at the far end looking at me. Yet when I focused, there was nothing, only the glint of the overhead lights and the empty seats. I realized with growing terror that the train moved not through geography, but through a space outside normal perception, and that the emptiness was more than absence, it was a kind of presence in itself. By the end of part one, I understood that the train was no longer merely a vehicle or a schedule. It had become a phenomenon, a presence with intention and awareness. The emptiness of its carriages was not vacancy, but observation, and the void beyond the station was a realm I could not comprehend. I had glimpsed something vast, patient, and deliberate, and I feared that my continued observation would tether me to it in ways I could not escape. I knew I would return again, drawn by fascination and terror, and that the weeks to come would reveal layers of horror that would test my perception, sanity, and understanding of reality itself. I could no longer pretend the train was an oddity I had seen once or twice and dismissed as tired eyes or imagination. The emptiness persisted with a regularity that made everything else feel incidental. It arrived at the same hour 3 nights each week, sometimes for its schedule precise as a heartbeat, and as relentless. The platform would empty of the usual late-night stragglers long before the digital clock ticked toward its minute, and I would wait with a notebook and a thermos of coffee, my hands shaking with a combination of anticipation and dread. On the nights I was not supposed to be working, I found myself taking the earlier train into the station, as if I were summoned. The city around the station slept, and the streets were quiet save for the distant murmur of traffic. The platform lights cast long rectangles onto the concrete, and the air smelled of iron and wet asphalt. I would stand at the yellow line, counting down until the rails sang and the machine that should have carried people moved in like a leviathan from another ocean, only to disgorge emptiness. At first, I try to map its scientifically, observing details that might be explained by maintenance crews or abandoned cars or some training. Exercise. The interior was always clean, as if it had been wiped down between passengers. The seats showed no indentation, no smudge, no forgotten phone or newspaper. The air vents hummed, but provided no warmth. The emergency brakes were in place, the chain pulls taut and untouched. The conductor panels registered normal power consumption, yet the passenger count read 0 on the scanner. I watched that readout with a fixation that felt obscene and private, as if by watching I might force an answer out of the thing itself. Then there were the sounds, and not sounds. The train made the expected noises of metal and wheels, yet beneath that mechanical vocabulary was a subtone like a chord played just outside. Hearing it vibrated in my teeth and dissolved into the station lights, as if the world were being filtered through a lens that softened edges. The static was not electrical alone. It felt like a measurement and attention the universe paying heed to. Something I could not name. I began to notice the timing of that subtone. It rose and fell with the passing of the train, and sometimes lingered in the concrete when the carriages were gone, as if the train left an echo in the station that did not belong to sound alone. Once I tried to board and remain until morning. I wanted to see where the train would go. I wanted to ride until sunrise and observe whether it met a terminus or an anomaly. The platform door closed behind me, and the electric hum deep in the carriage moved smoother than any commuter train I had taken. Domestic earthbound regularity slipped away. It did not feel like motion as much as an absence of place. I looked out the windows, expecting darkness turning into backyard lights, then suburbs, then the metabolic glow of the city. But outside was a wash of nothing, a black that had depth and texture but lacked spatial reference. There were no stations, no tunnels, no overhead cables, just a slow, impossible passage. I walked the length of the train and pressed my palm to the glass at one window. No face looked back, only my reflection, flattened and elongated by the angle of the pane. A small smear like the imprint of a fingertip marred one seat back. But it was not recent. The leather felt cold, as if unoccupied for a long time, but not abandoned. Either the emptiness meant the train had no passengers, or it meant something had removed them. Both possibilities were worse than ignorance. In the carriage opposite, I found evidence that suggested not the absence of life, but the absence of explanation. A small pile of papers lay on the floor, neatly stacked, as if someone had left them in a hurry. The top sheet had lines of tightly scrawled handwriting, but the letters blurred when I tried to focus on them, as if the ink in my eyes conspired to hide meaning. I took a photograph on my phone, and when I enlarged the image later, the paper showed only faint watermarks and the suggestion of text, nothing legible. The camera seemed to register less than my memory. The photographs I would later take of the interior often returned with anomalies unexplainable in camera physics, slanted light halos where none had been, and in one shot a faint double exposure that placed a silhouette at the far end of the carriage where there had been none. A security official found me at dawn, crouched on a seat, griping my notebook to my chest. He asked whether I had been drinking and whether I was authorized to be on the rails. I tried to explain, but the words were thin and seemed to leave residue in my mouth, like trying to speak underwater. He radioed for a patrol, and they escorted me out through gates that had the smell of disinfectant. The official tightened his hold on my shoulder and said there had been reports of vandals climbing aboard during the night. He seemed unconcerned by the detail of my report in a way that made me feel like a child telling a grown man a fairy tale and then being laughed at for persistence. The train became more daring with time, as if it were testing me. It would arrive when I was not ready, and I would see the tail lights vanish into the wrong end of the platform. It would arrive after hours and then depart carrying no one, but with a whisper like the tearing of the air itself. The timetable on the wall began to register phantom stops on nights. I recorded the arrival, a sequence of place names I had never seen scrawled in chalk across the schedule. And when I compared my notes to official scheduling logs, there were discrepancies. The digital manifesting and human record refusing to reconcile. People began to talk in small pockets in the station. Some stories ridiculed another kind of folk legend, more hushed and earnest, suggested something older was moving through the rails. I stayed on the platform longer, listening to the rumors that tasted like cobwebs and damp plaster. There was mention of a century when a line had been closed after an accident, but the dates were inconsistent. In each telling, a retired conductor spoke of a night train that carried remains from an old hospital and never returned to the records. Another sepia photograph in a bookshop showed carriages whose windows did not reflect light the way glass should, as if whatever was inside did not participate in reflection. I bought that book and kept it under my arm like a talisman. The edges of my life aligned with the train schedule. My relationships frayed because my attention had been co-opted by something that offered only emptiness in exchange, and not even the word empty felt adequate. There is a different vocabulary for absence. When it is orchestrated absence that watches you back, the train taught me that absence can be active as shape with intention that carves silence into the air and keeps it warm as if to make it familiar. I began to dream of rails where sleepers were laid as if on planks of bone and stations that were mouths. I woke with the taste of iron and the urge to return to the platform. Toward the end of the month, the train did something I could not anticipate. It stopped and left a bag on the platform. No one else saw it until I walked past and my eyes snagged on a dark shape near the bench. It was a small leather satchel scuffed at the corners, and it smelled faintly of mildew and perfume. The zippered compartment slid with a whisper revealing postcards, a pocket knife, a folded program from a theater with seats listed in a language I could not read, in a script that leaned slightly to the left. The handwriting on the back was written in a careful hand and simply said return. When read by someone who knows how to look, it was unsigned, but the postmarks were from towns that no longer existed on any current map. When I opened the satchel, there was a photograph. The print was old and the edges soft. The image showed a train platform somewhere far older than the modern station. I worked in a carriage could be seen in the background, and a woman in a dress stood in profile, clutching a child. The child stared at the camera with a solemn gaze that felt like a warning. She wore lace at the collar and something like a band around her head. The back of the photo had been smudged with tears or rain, but a single word remained legible in an ink that had seeped into the fiber of the paper. Watchers. I held the photograph too long then and felt foolish for the superstitions that rose in me. Like a fever, the satchel vanished by morning. When I returned to the platform, as if it had been removed the night before by some custodial hand or by the train itself, I found no record of its arrival nor of any reported lost property. The photograph remained in my pocket for days, becoming like a coin that warmed with touch. By the end of part 2, the train's chronology and my life had started to loop through each other. The more I tried to map things and to reason, the more they escaped. I felt the presence of the empty carriages, not as a void, but as a focus, a gaze that blurred the edges of my day and stretched the small, ordinary things until they felt uncanny. There was a pattern forming, one that suggested the train was not merely without passengers, but in search of something or someone. It left traces for me to find, as if to invite me deeper into its geography, and I was answering with every return to the platform. I tried to tell my supervisor, but the story sounded like a confession of madness. So I showed him the photograph. Instead, he frowned at it and shifted it in the light, as if the film itself were temperamental. He did not ask how I had obtained it. He only suggested I take a leave of absence, get some rest, step away from the platform for a while, which was a polite way of saying stop haunting the rails. He may have been trying to help, but I resented the distance his words had created, as if he were smoothing a wrinkle. I could not afford to ignore the train's appearances. Became less like chance and more like ritual. The schedule varied by a decimal or two of an hour. sometimes minutes. Sometimes it arrived between breaths. The station announcer's voice occasionally crackled, as if through a faulty mic, and the recorded message would misspeak, mentioning stops that belonged to another era. I recorded the phrases on a handheld device and played them back later at home, only to hear a low static under the track of speech that seemed to carry a rhythm not dissimilar to what I had been feeling under the carriage when the announcement misnamed a stop. I would cross-reference and find a coincidence in the satchel contents or the postcard from a vanished route. I found others who were watching, not the ridiculing commuters or the board security staff, but a network of people who moved with the same careful patience they met in the coffee shop across from the station at odd hours, knitting stories into the steam of their cups. Their faces were lined and determined. They had journals like mine, pocketed photographs and maps marked in red. They called themselves keepers, and their stories fit together like old threads in a tapestry. They had names of trains that did not exist, public records that had flickers of scheduling, and the same hush when they spoke of a particular carriage, as if uttering its number aloud might conjure something into being from them. I learned about disappearances that were never followed up, official reports that simply dissipated into missing persons files with no leads. There were stories of commuters who took late trains and never arrived home, of telephone calls where the line opened and then carried only the sound of rails. The keepers believed the train moved through a topology not bound to geography. It threaded through human attention and memory, slipping between time points, and it fed on the kind of loneliness that inhabits late-night platforms. People left things on seats and came back to find them rearranged or moved to different cities by morning. There were also warnings of people who tried to ride beyond stop and return change pale and unable to name the date of their last meal. Their leader was an older woman with a faded conductor patch sewn into her jacket. I will call her Mara because she told me names. Then fell quiet, and I sensed she guarded particulars as if they were live. She told me about a line that had been shut after a derailment decades ago, and the bodies that were never found. She showed me ragged newspaper clippings and a ledger with time stamped entries that all led to gaps. One page had been removed, leaving a frayed hole only the size of a thumbprint. The ledger smelled of dust and the kind of time that tries not to be. Notice we organized watches and shared data. I would patrol the platform, and the keepers sat at benches with thermoses and cameras, their conversation quiet. They taught me to listen to the subtone and to watch the air for shifts. I learned to sense the difference between a regular commuter train and this thing. It did not arrive with the same mechanical rhythm. This one inhaled into the night and exhaled absence. The keepers taught me rituals too small to seem like rituals, like placing salt beneath a bench or whispering names into a folded paper, then burning in the bin. They swore these little acts kept whatever the train was from claiming the station entirely, though they admitted that the protection felt modest, if not symbolic. One night our watch was rewarded with a revelation, and with terror. We had more of us on the platform than ever before, and the train came with a sound that sucked the breath from my lungs. The carriages bore the old paint of a line long since retired, and there were traces of soot along the door frames, like the residue of furnaces. This time, when the doors opened, the interior contained rows of luggage stacked with mortal neatness. There were trunks bound in canvas with brass buckles that had not been made in living memory, and a collection of umbrellas with handles carved from bone. My companion spoke in low voices at the discretion of the watch, and we noted the presence of boot prints on the floor, but the prints were not recent, and they pointed in no particular direction. At the far end of one carriage lay a bundle covered in a blanket. I stepped closer. because my feet moved as if commanded. I did not mean to, but the pull had been real. The blanket was stained with salt crystals and dust. When I pulled it back, there was nothing inside, only the impression of something like a torso and the faint scent of lavender mixed with coal. My hand trembled, and Mara stepped forward to catch my arm, her fingers cold and damp as if she had come in from rain. The group murmured then, and we retreated, though none of us wanted to leave the sight of that empty bundle behind. Back in the coffee shop, the keepers argued about whether the train took passengers or whether it removed them and kept them in some in-between. The ledger suggested both, and neither. The older pages of the journal had notations of return or recovery dates that had been crossed out later for every story. Of a missing commuter, there was a counter story about those who returned years later, claiming they had only been gone an hour. Their eyes were different, their speech measured, their history shredded in ways that made every return a loss of sorts. The phenomenon began to enter my dreams, less as surreal vistas and more as memory, as if I had once been aboard and forgotten. The satchel photograph of the woman and child invaded these visions, and I found myself in places whose architecture matched photographs in my childhood that I had never visited. The train implants patterns, and those patterns can be personal. The keepers told me that the train reads the people who watch it. It finds threads in their history and weaves them into its route when the train cares enough to leave. A token, it is inviting the watcher to follow, and that invitation is never neutral. On a bitter evening in late winter, I boarded the train despite protocol and fear, despite the keepers who begged me to stay away. Concrete under my shoes went cold differently, and the carriage hummed in the way I had come to recognize. The windows revealed the blank as before, but there was a smear of movement at the periphery, like a page turning. I moved down the aisle with the sound of my breath loud in my ears, and found in a luggage rack a single ticket folded into quarters. It had my name on it, but in handwriting that belonged to a decade I did not live in. The date field, the year was wrong, and the station of return was scribbled with a place name that the keepers had never heard. I unfolded the ticket and felt the papers warp as if someone had pressed it with their palm during a goodbye. I tried to leave the carriage, but the doors slid closed with a softness that was not mechanical. The lights dimmed, and a voice from somewhere in the train said one word, my name, and I understood that the train had noticed me, had registered my persistence, and was answering with the intimacy of an animal observing a pattern of behavior. I can still feel that word like a nail inside my ribs. The carriage seemed to swell outward and then contract. I felt like a lens through which some other thing was trying to look my life in, and perhaps through. I left the train before it returned to the station and stumbled into the night, clutching the ticket. The keepers came at once, and their faces were grave. They did not ask how I had been foolish. They said instead that there were nights the train would tempt and nights it would consume. They spoke of someone who had once ridden all the way to the end, only to find a station populated with wax figures and an announcement calling his name in a voice that belonged to his mother. Though she had been dead for 20 years, he had never been the same. By the 4th month, I had become tethered to the train. My days, nights, thoughts, and even the quiet moments at home were shaped by anticipation and dread. The platform was no longer a place of work or transit, but a threshold where time bent and ordinary rules collapsed. I arrived before the lights flickered on and stayed long after they dimmed, notebook in hand, fingers tracing the edges of tickets, photographs, and satchels the train left behind, as if it wanted me to see and understand without providing answers. The keepers became more insistent. They told me that watching without action was dangerous, that the train did not simply passively appear, but observe the watchers in turn. Each of us had our own schedule, our own vulnerabilities, and the train adjusted itself to exploit them. One of the younger keepers disappeared after claiming he had boarded to photograph the seats. He returned 3 days later pale, silent, and unable to describe where he had been. His camera, which he had clutched to his chest, contained only black frames. Every night thereafter, he refused to speak of the train and avoided the platform entirely. I began to notice subtle distortions in the station itself. The clock hand sometimes reversed for moments I could not quantify. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythms that mimicked the hum of the empty carriages. Shadows formed in the corners of rooms where none should exist, elongating and twisting in ways inconsistent with the light source. The train no longer simply arrived, it reached out. The subtone, once a vibration beneath perception, became a pulsing pressure in my skull, aligning with my heartbeat until I could not distinguish my rhythm from its signal. One night, I followed the train beyond platform. It glided onto rails that should have ended decades ago, through tunnels that had long been sealed, over bridges I had never seen, into landscapes that warped and folded impossibly. Trees bent unnaturally, their branches swaying though the air was still. Buildings appeared partially constructed or crumbling, yet the structural elements remained eerily pristine. I felt as though I was traveling through a memory not my own, a record of places that had never existed in my life, yet were inscribed into a collective, unseen geography. Inside the train, I saw signs of habitation, or at least the illusion of it. A small teacup sat on a fold-down table, faint rings marking its surface. A scarf hung over the back of a seat, fibers frozen mid-sway as if caught in motion. The faint smell of perfume, dust, and metal hung in the air. I sensed movement just beyond the edges of vision. Occasionally a shadow would flit down a corridor and vanish when I turned. I began to speak aloud, asking questions, demanding recognition. Yet the only response was a slight hum, a vibration in the floor, a flicker of lights. The train communicated not through sound, but through presence and absence. That night, I found a ledger, much like the keeper's books, but older. Names were crossed out, dates altered, destinations changed. Some names were mine, some familiar, some I did not recognize. Each entry seemed to correlate with observations of the train's empty passages and strange arrivals. I understood in a cold clarity that the train had a history, a memory, and that memory included me. I was no longer a passive observer. The ledger suggested a contract I had not signed, a connection I could not sever. I was already part of the train's record. By the end of the 4th month, I realized the train was not merely a vehicle or a schedule anomaly, but a patient and intelligent entity. Its emptiness was active, deliberate, and inescapable. It measured our attention, chronicled our actions, and left artifacts for those it deemed worthy or curious. I was now ensnared in a rhythm dictated by its appearances. I knew that each return to the platform, each boarding, each observation further bound me to its impossible geography. The train had become a presence in my life, a constant hum in my thoughts, and an unyielding, silent witness to my existence. The 5th month marked the complete dissolution of my understanding of time, space, and self. The train's influence had expanded beyond the platform into my daily life, shaping perception and thought. I could hear the subtone in quiet moments, feel it pulsing beneath the floorboards, vibrating in the walls. My dreams were no longer escapable. They were extensions of the train, corridors of empty carriages and platforms that stretched infinitely into darkness. Faces appeared in windows and vanished when I looked directly. Whispers echoed faintly, carrying fragments of conversation I did not recognize but understood with an unnerving clarity. I began to notice changes in my body. My heartbeat aligned with the vibrations of the tracks. My reflexes synchronized with the sway of the carriages. My vision occasionally flickered to the geometry of the empty seats. I could no longer distinguish between moments I experienced aboard the train and moments I experienced on the platform. Reality had folded in on itself. My apartment sometimes felt like another carriage. The furniture aligned unnaturally. Shadows shifted in impossible angles, and the faint smell of metal and perfume lingered in corners. The keepers warned me that my tethering was deepening, that the train did not merely observe, it absorbed. I understood what they meant when one night I awoke with a memory of events I had never lived. A late-night commuter collapsing onto a seat, a conductor calling out names in a forgotten dialect, a bundle of clothing arranged meticulously as though someone invisible had just left it. I could recall details with perfect clarity, yet I knew I had not witnessed them. My mind was becoming a ledger, a repository for the train's memory. One night, I boarded without hesitation. The doors closed, lights flickered, and the vibration beneath my feet became a pulse that matched my heartbeat perfectly. The windows revealed landscapes that should not exist, merging familiar cityscapes with impossible geometries. Corridors stretched longer than possible. Shadows moved at angles that defied physics. A faint outline of passengers appeared in some seats, blurred and indistinct, watching me. When I spoke, the voices of the missing answered faintly, syllables that mirrored my own thoughts. I realized that the train was not empty. It was occupied in a way I could not perceive, populated with presences that existed outside ordinary human senses. I found a door at the far end of a carriage that I had never noticed before. It was unmarked, unassuming, yet radiated an almost imperceptible heat. I opened it slowly. Inside was a room filled with artifacts from passengers long vanished. Letters, photographs, toys, tickets, luggage. Each item bore traces of its owner. Yet the space was suffused with a weight, a consciousness that was neither hostile nor benign. I understood that the train was a vessel, not of steel alone, but of memory, observation, and essence. It recorded everything and everyone it touched, weaving them into its endless journey. I returned to the platform eventually, carrying an object I could not name, something the train had given me, an artifact that pulsed faintly in my hand. The keeper stared, and Mara whispered a warning. The train rewards curiosity, but punishes comprehension. Its gifts are both proof and prison. I understood, then, that the train had already marked me, integrated my presence into its rhythm, and that every observation, every note, every attempt to understand had deepened the tether. The train continues to arrive. I watch it nightly. Each time I see the empty carriages, I know they are full. Each time I hear the subtone, I feel in my bones. Each time I step onto the platform, I am part of a pattern older than memory and yet freshly inscribed. I am tethered and watched, observed and cataloged. My reflection sometimes moves independently in the glass of the carriage windows, mirroring what the train perceives rather than what I am. I know now that the train does not simply transport passengers. It transports existence itself, and that I and anyone who observes are not outside its journey, but forever within it. Even writing this now, I feel its pull in the silence between words, the vibration beneath my feet, the impossibility of separating my life from its rhythm. It is patient, it is deliberate, it is eternal, and it waits for all who watch, all who follow, all who tether themselves to the empty carriages.